There you go.
And we're live. This is great. So we're just going to get started now. We're starting this webinar on designing a purpose-driven circular economy. We are really glad to have a number of people that are joining us from around the world live, as well as those that are going to be viewing this recording later on. I wanted to make sure that we are here. First of all, wanted to acknowledge my co-host from the Danish Design Center, Christian Bason. There's also
hello, everyone.
Here. Hello. And the one thing as an introduction I will say is that this webinar that we're presenting is really a follow-up to a workshop that Christian and I designed together and delivered at the Service Design Global Conference, which was recently here in Toronto, Canada. So what we decided to do is, because there was a lot of interest in that workshop, and that was sold out and a lot of people following up on it, to offer this as a webinar version and share some of the ideas. And because we're both very interested in advancing the conversation about purpose-driven business and the circular economy and what it's going to mean for our future. So I'll just go over a little bit about how this webinar will flow. First of all, Christian is going to be framing the challenge for us, sharing lots of important information and around the trends that are happening, some signals, what we're seeing in the landscape, as well as some examples of exciting work that's going on in Denmark and elsewhere. I'll be talking a little bit about designing the organization for purpose, around what is a purpose-driven business and how might that be governed, as well as I'll be sharing some tool around designing the business model for circular, and going through an example using a Volkswagen group as a case study. And so we chose that case study for the purposes of our workshop, and it's using publicly available information. I'll just disclose that. We'll have time at the end for Q&A, and also we are going to be offering opportunities for interaction. We'd love to get to know who is on who's on the webinar, what people are interested in, what they think. And so at different points, we're going to be putting up a little quick polls, and we invite you to participate in those, and we'll be able to see some of those results. So I think the first poll will be coming up shortly. So for myself, I just want to introduce myself. I am Mark Kuznicki. I am one of the co-founders of The Moment. We're an innovation design studio here in Toronto, Canada, where we pursue our purpose through self-management. So it's a little bit of a unique characteristic of us, as being a purpose-driven design firm, and that is managed through by its members. And our purpose is to empower people to lead change and co-create a thriving human future. And our interest really in this work is really about all the different ways that the different people that we work with and partner with might be in that position to lead change, and how the kinds of change that we're going to need in order for us all to thrive in an uncertain future. And so that's a little bit about The Moment. And now I'm going to turn it over to Christian to introduce himself, and then to set the scene and frame the challenge for us.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Christian Bason. I'm the CEO of the Danish Design Center. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to build further on the workshop that Mark and I ran in Toronto not too long ago. So the Danish Design Center is co-funded by the Danish government, Ministry of Business. We've been around for more than 40 years, working to advance the value of design for organizations and individuals and society. And today we are in this small building on the waterfront in Copenhagen, sharing it with the Architecture Center and other institutions working to advance our field. Just like Mark mentioned, the notion of empowering people, empowering organizations and societal and policy actors to really embrace design and to activate the methods and mindsets of designers is key for our work. So what we do is basically we run training, we run innovation and design programs, and we spend a lot of energy also on sharing stories about how design plays out, not least from a Danish and Nordic perspective. So let's frame the challenge that we'll spend our time on this afternoon. I think what's good to start with is to consider how did we end up where we are now, and how did we end up facing this kind of somewhat uncertain and turbulent future. This image, which by the way, I noticed they have a similar bull like this one actually in Shanghai, near the waterfront in that city, and then when I saw it a few weeks ago, I thought to myself, well, this is a global symbol of course, of finance and trade and markets. However, one of the reasons I think we are in the global situation we're in today is that we had the global financial crisis not more than, but over 10 years ago, it kicked off. And in a sense, some of the repercussions of the financial crisis are still with us in terms of drops in trust, increased inequality, not least also in industrialized Western countries, and a sense that institutions, both political institutions, but also corporate ones, have not really delivered the type of future that a lot of people were hoping for, and that is then providing some political backlash. This one is an attempt to illustrate, I don't know how many of you know the logo, but it's actually the symbol or the logo for Cambridge Analytica. And you could say that a bit more recently, the global tech industry has also begun to be challenged by questions around ethics, questions around privacy, questions around how our data is being used or misused. And in a sense, you can say that the time when we were looking to the Bay Area and the Silicon Valley model of technological innovation and scaling growth in digital corporates is becoming maybe a less attractive model. And in many ways, you're seeing multiple models of innovation and technology arise around the world that are perhaps offering different visions of our technological future. And certainly, there's a lot of change happening now in the tech scene globally. Finally, and this is even more recent, so we have the global move, not least led by young people, around climate change. And somehow this move is becoming the global agenda that governments need to relate to. The Danish government, for instance, with the new prime minister coming in this summer, has just launched yesterday 13 new ambitious partnerships between the government and private industry to address how to deal with climate change and how to find new solutions to achieve a 70% reduction goal by 2030. And those partnerships cut across industries from marine and shipping to food to manufacturing to transportation, mobility, and so forth. So you're really seeing a lot of concerted efforts around this agenda. And interestingly, you'd also see that in the European Union, where climate change on the one side, social cohesion, but also, and then also digital is at the top of the agenda. Next slide. So you can say that the question of purpose has become a real rising agenda, an agenda that questions what are the longer term goals of organizations. And just an interesting data point on that one is that one of the biggest corporates in Denmark, it's called Grundfos, has launched from the CEO side the ambition to not just sell water pumps, which is they manufacture, but also to bring clean water to 300 million people. So the image I'm showing now from a small Swiss village called Davos, where the World Economic Forum meets every year, is illustrating how CEOs of corporates like the CEO of this Danish company, Grundfos, the CEO who, by the way, also usually attends the summit there, are shifting their attention to broader purpose and contribution to society. So at this year's World Economic Forum Summit, there was a study launched and published by Deloitte that showed that for the first time that they've tracked it, global CEOs are ranking responsibility and contribution to society higher than return to shareholders. And that, I think, is a quite significant development that shows there's really a tide shifting in terms of how you orient business. So if we're to define what do we mean by purpose, you could say this is one of the formal definitions, that it is a commitment to carrying out actions in the future in search of a desired outcome. And that outcome is certainly beginning to shift on the back of those global developments. So you can say that this shift towards purpose drives the need for transformation, drives the need for more sustainable business models, and the need for more sustainable business models that create new kinds of value or broader, more holistic forms of value is also what drives the search for new organizational models for how do we structure and organize our companies and even our public sector, and by the way, with which values and with which culture do we want within our organizations in pursuit of those new business models. So defining, and that's of course relevant for this session, what do we then mean by circular economy, and what do we mean by pursuing that kind of value creating model? And here we're talking about the principles of designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use, and regenerating natural systems. And that broad definition of circular economy is then what is being pursued in different shapes and forms by corporates around the world, and also is the interest of governments. So for example, again, Denmark has actually a government strategy that was developed by the Ministry of Business to further and advance circular economy as an approach in the Danish economy. To sum up, you can say that we have the pivot towards new types of purpose, you have the attention to new types of business models, and we have then, as a consequence, the pursuit of new organizational models, which I think Michael maybe also addressed a little bit. But basically, this is sort of a broad way of seeing what is the transformation agenda we're looking at. So let me just give you a brief example from our own work at the Danish Design Center, where we've collaborated with a major philanthropy in Denmark to explore what would a circular construction challenge look like. By circular construction challenge, what we mean is addressing a set of the global United Nations goals to ask the question, could we find new approaches to design a world, especially around the built environment and cities, where waste does not exist, or where we radically reduce the amount of waste, and also where we radically change how we manufacture for construction industries, so to reduce CO2 footprint and further ameliorate climate change. So this innovation challenge that we embedded with a set of design methods, for example, in boot camps and training sessions, led to 3 winners, each winner demonstrating a particular business model and set of solutions around circular value creation. And I brought along a short film that will give you a little bit more insight into the nature of the project and nature of those winners.
Yeah, so we'll play that video just to make sure that it flows well. There's a few more images here.
Those images are just a couple of illustrations from the project. First one was around, well, all 3 of them the winners, and just the last one here might interest you that this is one of the winners, which is creating construction material out of fungi, out of living organisms, mycelium, which is actually proven to be quite promising building materials. Now we're bringing living organisms into our construction material. This is a project that won one of the challenge awards run by the Danish Technological University.
There's the video.
Here's another, just an illustration from another one of the winners, which is basically a sustainable shed. The motto for the project is everybody wants a cool shed, and this one is created entirely from upcycled, reused construction materials and tile and so on. Let's see the film.
Yeah.
Imagine if waste didn't exist. Imagine if we designed a world where all kinds of waste was considered a valuable resource, where we reused precious resources like wood, steel, and concrete. What if we could create the zero waste world? All over the world, more and more people need places to live, work, and play. But when we build, we also create waste. Globally, over 2 billion tons of waste is generated every year. About half of this comes from construction. In 2018, the Danish Philanthropic Association, Volkswagen, asked innovators to bring their best ideas for turning waste into innovative solutions for the built environment.
Circular Construction Challenge har givet os muligheden for at prøve vores forretningsmodel i den virkelige verden. Vi er 3 store partnere, som er gået sammen om at skabe en ny cirkulær løsning for byggeriet. Fra start
Hvis vi i Danmark byggede alle sekundære byggerier, som stod her i genbrugsmaterialer, så ville vi faktisk spare 40.000 ton CO2 om året. Designmetoderne har hjulpet os til at dække sig kort.
Great.
Right. So what you saw were a couple of examples of concrete projects that were stimulated through an innovation challenge driven by design and trained with design. And I should mention that the 3 winners here were all selected by an international jury, and also that the winners have already built partnerships that are global and international. So even though they are anchored in Denmark, they are actually quite global and international in scope. So just to round off my piece of this presentation, I think the big question is whether we also need to look beyond circular. And by that I mean that circular economy has been framed very much around the manufacture and the use of products, moving from linear value chains to circular models. But what about the next way to create value? And I would say that as the context of business becomes ever more turbulent and unpredictable, as industries and value chains are becoming more redundant, then yes, we should absolutely, where relevant, shift to a circular economy, but maybe even go beyond that to ecosystems and value co-production, where the notion of building collaborative value creating systems might even be a broader and even more relevant approach to strategy when it comes to sectors and fields that are not full of materials necessarily, but are still full of product service systems and service delivery and so on. So to conclude, I'd say the question, and this is a great book I can recommend looking into this field of designing for value creation across networks, that maybe the challenge is to devise ways where we can co-produce value across network systems, and that could be a even more holistic way to look at where we need to go in the longer term, including, of course, embracing the circular economy.
That's great. Thank you, Christian. So before we move on to the next section, I think now's a good time to put our first poll question out to people, which is, are you adopting these circular economy principles in your organization currently? Now that we've had some definitions on that, we'd love to get a sense of what the current state is for those of you that are interested in this and have joined into this webinar. So that is now open, and feel free to interact with that. We'll keep that open for a minute or so before we move on. And so we've got some good early adopters showing up, and lots of people that are curious, and but other people that aren't sure. So I think that's what we were kind of expecting. We are very much interested in advancing the conversation and getting more of these conversations happening in more organizations. So I think this is a great indicator of kind of where we're at. So I think we're going to move on to the next section. And I'm going to just make sure I can do this properly. There we go. All right, so I wanted to, from Christian sort of setting the context and the frame of the big picture challenge, and I think what was really great is thinking about, you know, how purpose, business models, and organization models work together. And so that's why I wanted to share this piece around what we're seeing in terms of how do you actually design an organization in governance around purpose. So just again, to come back to purpose, you know, this question of what is purpose in a company setting, in a business setting. And we like to say that purpose is why you exist. It's a just cause. It's a vision so compelling that people are willing to take on big challenges to achieve it. And so the interesting thing that we're seeing actually in our own experiences is that when purpose leads, the organization demonstrates a lot of flexibility and adaptivity to make really big shifts in order to advance that cause and adapt to rapidly changing conditions. And what we've also discovered is that, and you see this particularly in new venture development, is that the purpose of the organization comes out through the stories that people tell around why. You know, why were they doing the things that they were doing? What was the fuel of passion that allowed people to move through those early days of struggle? Often reveals a lot about purpose. And the important thing that we wanted to call out is that it's not just another form of branding exercise. It is actually quite more fundamental than that. And I would say that brand follows purpose, not leading it. So for example, in this Kickstarter, you know, example here, it's, you know, you could say, well, okay, this is a jewelry or a fashion product, and that's why it's being created is for the purposes of fashion. And really the why behind this bracelet with captured atmospheric carbon is for the organization the people behind this Kickstarter campaign are interested in demonstrating that there may be markets for captured carbon. And so they're trying to demonstrate and create markets for something that would otherwise, you know, not be used, or to demonstrate that there is a future where captured carbon becomes a new material. So I think that's an indicator of what the difference is between purpose and let's say, you know, your product and your mission. And so purpose is realized through the decisions that everybody makes within an organization every day. It's a sum of many different actions. And so the question is, how might we structure an organization where purpose is truly in charge, and what the practices of organizations are where everyone has a clear sense of what is needed and can meaningfully contribute to the pursuit of something that's much bigger than themselves. So one way of thinking about this is around the encoding of these kinds of structures within B Corps. One of the things that I've noted in particular is how that for B Corp certification, one of the things that B Corp must do is first amend its articles of incorporation so that the directors are thinking and making decisions based on the balance of needs across the long-term interests, short-term and long-term interests of stakeholders, including the shareholders, employees, suppliers, creditors, consumers, the government, and the environment, and the community and society in which the corporation operates. And so this is actually quite a challenge to traditional definitions of the purpose of the corporation and what the role of directors is in terms of maximizing shareholder value. And so it's not just a matter of a statement, it's actually encoding into the legal agreements and the foundational documents of the corporation itself. So one thing that we have implemented is in our organization is holacracy. So the thing that we love about holacracy as an operating system for purpose and self-management is that it is uniquely organized around purpose, and it creates a very clear set of rules that are documented in the Constitution that everybody is held accountable to, that in order to unlock that purpose, to discover that purpose, and to unlock the human potential of everybody in the organization in the pursuit of that purpose. And so one of the things that we are finding is that it is uniquely well suited to face a world that is increasingly volatile, uncertain, and ambiguous and complex. And in that pursuit of what many organizations have been pursuing within business transformation agendas for many years around adaptivity and agility. And really that's a very difficult thing to achieve through the traditional command and control hierarchical structures. And so what we're finding with holacracy is that a lot of that adaptivity and speed is being unlocked by having really a different rule set for how the organization is structured. We are very much believers in that holacracy is a useful system, but it is not complete. It is a challenging thing to implement, and there's a lot of things that can be added to it, but we feel that it has some unique characteristics that make it really well suited for the future. And one of the things that we want to share with people is that within holacracy, as a unique operating system that is governed by purpose, the organization as a whole has a purpose, but every role has a purpose and a set of accountabilities. And those rules are grouped together in functional groups called circles. Every circle has its higher order purpose and set of accountabilities. And all of these purposes and accountabilities all ladder up to the company's overall purpose. So the idea of a hierarchy of purpose as opposed to a hierarchy of people is really a key component to how this works. And every role is accountable to their purpose, but also enjoys autonomy in how it does its work. And so as a result of this, the kinds of outcomes that we're experiencing as an organization and seeing with a lot of our brother and sister companies that are on a similar path is that there is increased agility and responsiveness to change, and there's empowerment and engagement of everyone. And so anything where you have an ambitious purpose, where you're really trying to make a dent in the world, can be a very powerful fuel for people in terms of their commitment to their work. And it's important to unleash that through these kinds of structures that enable people to have autonomy while also having high levels of accountability towards those purposes. So the important thing about how these kinds of structures work within the organization is through priorities and dynamic steering. So roles can make decisions quickly by exercising their autonomy and can solicit advice from others if they need it. And the organization uses a series of metrics that are transparent to all, to everyone, that are aligned to purpose outcomes. And those metrics are shared weekly and monthly. It's a very important part of the practice to constantly coming back to outcomes and measurement. And to support alignment and quick decisions made by everyone in their roles, there are decision-making rules of thumb are established and expressed as priorities against each other. So this is not one that that we're using, but it's an example, an illustration of what a priority is expressed as even over. So in this case, philosophically, we would say that we are engaged in the long run pursuit of purpose, even over short-term profit maximization. Those are two things that we both want. We want the long-term purpose. We also want profits. We're not in any way against profits. But when we're faced with a choice of getting a little bit extra short-term profit in a way that damages our long-term purpose, then this rubric, this pattern allows us to make those decisions because we've already thought about it in advance. They're not dealt with as one-off situations. And that's really key to enabling the empowerment and to enable the continuous experimentation and adaptation that is required to pursue a purpose in an uncertain environment. So really key to this is really dynamic reorganization. So there's a sense where, and this is again a unique characteristic of these kinds of systems, is any role can propose a change into how their circle, the team, the structure that they work within, is governed in pursuit of its purpose. And so there's an encouragement of people to, if something's not working, propose a change. And that's actually can be a change in structure. That can be a change in somebody's role, the creation of a new role, removing an accountability from a role or adding an accountability to a role. And so the organizational design itself becomes a dynamic practice. It's no longer a one-time reorganization that you do every few years and takes 18 months to implement. It's a constant iterative process of improvement. So there are limits to what people can actually do. There are safety valves on this, but the bias is for experimentation and doing things that are safe to try. And so there's an ultimate test for anything that's a big decision, a big change, is will it cause harm to our purpose? And that is really ultimately the litmus test that we use for these kinds of decisions. So we're seeing a future where a possible future, and one that I think is a desirable future, where most businesses are actively pursuing a just cause as their path to business success, that those causes are aligned to what the world needs. And so Christian pointed to the Global Sustainable Development Goals earlier in the Circular Economy Challenge. So the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals set at the global level, are really a very good framework for understanding what the world needs and for aligning activities and outcomes to those. And we see a future where the people in these organizations are empowered to design and test solutions to solve for both impact and business results, and where employees, customers, and other stakeholders are co-creating value as a distributed ecosystem, like what Christian was sharing with us. And I will just say in that last note, what's really interesting is we participate in communities of practice that are implementing these new kinds of practices within their own organizations. We're seeing how these self-organizing systems of organizations are actually well suited to collaboration with each other, and where you are starting to see some interesting interactions happening, and the traditional boundaries of this organization versus that organization start to become a bit blurrier, and allow for that co-creation and collaboration as an ecosystem to be really be realized. And so we are very interested in this, and we are also suggesting that the future of work, and whatever work looks like in the future, and the point of how humans interact in that future, needs to be designed, and it needs to be designed in a way that has a number of these principles in that. So I'm gonna switch into the business model piece, and go into a tool that we wanted to share. So the business model for circular, we wanted to share a tool which is the Flourishing Business Canvas. This project is one of a number of projects around the world around looking at how do we create more sustainable business models, and what are the tools that we need to do that. This tool has been developed by a group organized as the Strongly Sustainable Business Model Group, which is an initiative of the Strategic Innovation Lab here at OCAD University in Toronto. It is an extension to the business model canvas, which was developed by Alex Osterwalder of Strategizer, and it is based on peer-reviewed research. And so if you're interested in the tool itself, it's still in sort of a pre-release beta mode. You can go to www.flourishingbusiness.org, where you can learn more about the project and potentially access their program to be able to test and use the tool. So we're going to be exploring that with, again, the case study of Volkswagen Group. So Volkswagen Group is obviously a very large, and when you look at all the brands involved, and some of them are very high-end luxury brands, a large global concern. It's either at the number 1 or number 2 in terms of the largest automaker in the world. And for those that have followed these stories, the Dieselgate scandal of 2015, where Volkswagen was discovered to be cheating on emissions tests for their turbo diesel engines, they actually incurred fines, lawsuits, and had to pay compensation that in total to date have cost 30 billion euros. So we used this case study to explore what would the transition to circular look like for something as traditional as an automobile manufacturer, as sort of the quintessential 20th century industrial sector. And so the challenge that we were putting in front of our folks that were participating in our workshop was that the CEO has come to you as a strategic design leader looking for recommendation in pursuit of 3 goals that are aligned to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And those goals being climate action, number 13, responsible consumption and production, number 12, and decent work and economic growth, number 8. So I believe probably most people on this call are familiar with the business model canvas. Again, if you're not, please do go to strategizer.com and you can learn more about it. There's some great videos there about the business model canvas as well as the value proposition canvas. We use them as core tools in terms of designing new value propositions and business models with our clients. The traditional business model canvas you see has the value propositions in the center. You have on the right, you have the customer segments and that are served through channels and in particular kinds of customer relationships. Those value propositions are created through doing key activities and applying those key activities to key resources, and through the engagement of key partners. So on the left side, you have basically the costs of producing these value propositions, and on the right, you have the revenues and the customer side. And obviously the goal here with the business model canvas is to optimize your business model for product market fit and to pursue profits through that. So The interesting thing when we look at applying the Flourishing business canvas is we're bringing in additional layers and lenses onto the core business challenge around costs and revenues and product market fit. So in here we have 3 contexts: the economy, the society, and environment. And we have a number of different additions to the canvas, or changes from the original business model canvas, to bring in the idea of sustainability and circular principles into the business model design process. So the one thing I would point out at the bottom, we have outcomes. So yes, there are costs, absolutely. Some of those are economic costs, in terms of the cost of production, for example, but some of them are also costs to society, costs to the environment. So we, within this kind of a tool, we're actually bringing in the externalities of what is generally external to the firm and bringing it into the design process. The other thing that is not on the traditional business model canvas are goals. So these goals are normative goals. These are goals about what we want to achieve in terms of impact, or what is the particular direction that we want to go in as an organization, that would allow us to know which ways we're going to engage in circular business model design questions. And so on the right side, we have benefits, and obviously there are benefits from the economic point of view in terms of the revenues to the organization and strategic value and others. There's also potential benefits to society, potential benefits to the actual organization itself. So next on the right, we have the people side of this canvas. Within that, you have the ecosystem actors. And the other part of this that is important is how those ecosystem actors exist in the ecosystem. They can be in society, in the environment. They're part of the environment around the organization. When they become stakeholders, they choose to take a role in relationship to the organization itself. So that's the difference between an ecosystem actor and a stakeholder. Again, those stakeholders are engaged with the organization through relationships and channels. And the difference, obviously, in the value proposition area is that we have these positive and negative aspects. So there's value co-creations, so those kinds of value that we can create for and with customers and for and with other stakeholders. And also looking at value co-destruction. So those kinds of value or things that some of our stakeholders may value that might be actually destroyed as a byproduct of our activities within the business. So we look at it as both positive and negative forms of value. On the left, we have a process. So on the process side, again, working from the outside in, we have biophysical stocks. So those are the things that are available in the environment to draw upon. Those stocks produce services, streams of value that we can use. Some of those turn into specific resources for the use of the organization in its core activities. And again, we have partnerships as part of this business model. A new addition in this context is governance. So as we mentioned before, governance towards purpose and governance towards impact and other kinds of goals is an important question. And so that is an additional element that's added to this version of a business canvas. So coming back to the Volkswagen Group case study, some things to note is that there are a number of very key things in these transitions. So this is part of Volkswagen's expressed strategy, is the transition to electric and the transition to mobility. Some things that we have to be aware of with the transition to electric is that while the GHG emissions decrease in the use stage, so in the use of the vehicle, there's again, depending on the source of the energy that is used to charge the electric vehicle, But the shift happens where the GHG emissions actually increase significantly in the production stage, as it takes 2 times the amount of energy to produce an electric car versus a traditional internal combustion vehicle. Obviously, the other thing around electric and batteries is that the metals and materials used within batteries are often hazardous and toxic to the environment. There's a lot of rare earth elements that are used in this. The mining practices of some of these rare earth metals are a concern from a human rights perspective as well. The other thing to note that's really important around the shift to electric is that electric vehicles are much simpler in terms of the complexity of components, parts, subsystems. There are fewer parts, there are fewer systems, and that means fewer suppliers and potentially less employment. And that is of particular interest in terms of the case of Volkswagen, where the role of labor and the role of government in its governance and actually in its ownership as well is a really key factor. And the transition to mobility, so this idea of moving to a mobility service as opposed to selling the car, that's obviously a transition that's already happening underway. You know, Uber is obviously the example everyone points to. But the other thing to note is that the connection between the transition to electric and transition to mobility and how those two things can come together. So that, you know, if everybody, you know, just keeps on using more and more vehicles, you know, that is the benefits of some of that conversion are less than if there's actually fewer vehicles on the road and the use of those vehicles is more optimized. So it's actually more efficient, you know, and effective from an environmental perspective to get people out of cars completely and into public transport. And it's important to note that both government and the industry are highly vested in the whole concept of personal car ownership. And there's a lot of cultural norms around that. And ultimately, there's, you know, the opportunity of car sharing is potentially reducing the demand for car ownership and therefore the demand for manufacturing. And there's a number of options in terms of the models. So the one thing we wanted to point to is to show like where this could go is this is actually happening today. So Volkswagen has announced and began production on the model ID3, which is their first mass-produced electric vehicle platform. And it's really, they're framing it as the 3rd generation people's car in the tradition of the Beetle and the Golf. And they've converted an entire production plant to be purely a transition to electric vehicle production. They're the first legacy automaker to engage in that conversion. And with these factories, they have an intention to be carbon neutral throughout the production process through very detailed work around energy, the use of green energy, employing new technology, minimizing emissions throughout the production process, and for anything that's left over from a carbon perspective of actually doing offsets so that they can, from launch, claim to be carbon neutral with this plant, and they were continuing to optimize the plant to continue to reduce the direct emissions. So we did a really quick version of this to just see what does it look like when you convert the legacy business model into the Flourishing business canvas. And here are some examples of what that looks like. And just to give you a sense of how this will look, and I'll zoom into different pieces. So when you're looking at the yellow Post-its on this canvas, those are the same types of things that were on the original business model canvas. So the same types of content shows up in both versions. In the orange, you will see new factors brought in, particularly with the economic lens around how the organization runs that are not in the original business model canvas. And then we have the light green, which are elements that are connected to society impacts and costs and benefits. as well as the dark green, which is at the level of the actual environment. So I'll zoom in on a few pieces just to see how this works. So you'll see here in the goals section, we have the actual climate action and responsible consumption production, SDGs, as part of the goals, the transition to mobility, maintaining market leadership. You can see on how the various new actors, system actors, ecosystem actors start to take roles as stakeholders with respect to the corporation, NGOs, regulatory bodies, and customers as well. Workers are very important. New value co-creations around new electric vehicle platforms, mobility as a service solution, materials recovery offerings, as well as value co-creation specifically in the environmental space, where we're hoping to renew and restore some of the ecosystem damage of the past. But also there's potentially value co-destructions in the transition. There's the toxic metals impacts and potentially employment loss and impact to society through those changes. On the left side, you see the biophysical stocks, the ecosystem services, and that are accessed in order to produce the resources and activities of the organization. You see in governance, you see sustainability councils and stakeholder panels, and obviously in the Volkswagen example, the role of works councils in the governance process of a Volkswagen Group is a significant characteristic of the governance process there. The interests of workers being a key aspect. And then you see some of the costs looked at. So yes, there are the traditional kinds of costs of the delivery of these new value propositions for the corporation, but there's also potentially costs to society in terms of employment transition costs or local community impacts. There are costs in terms of new costs in different kinds of uses of materials and uses of water and different kinds of emissions that need to be factored in as well. And so overall, what I've enjoyed about using this tool is first of all, as a taxonomy to understand how to bring externalities into the design process when you think about creating sustainable business models, and a way of having conversations about those different elements and how they need to be designed together, and potentially the opportunity to actually co-design with stakeholders entirely new ways of creating value or mitigating value destruction that is underway currently. So that's a little bit about the tool. We wanted to leave we have a last poll to put out here. So we'll do a really quick poll on this one, which is how much do you agree with the statement? New approaches to business purpose and circular business models are required for the future. And you may disagree with this. This may not be a requirement. It might be something that's not actually important to you. I have a sneaky suspicion if you join this webinar, you have an interest. So we'll leave that open for a bit. And I'm also conscious of time. We have 7 minutes left. I'm wondering if it's possible for us to maybe look at some questions while we're collecting the poll. Is that something we can do?
Yeah. Mark, this is Christian here. I did give a couple of answers in writing to a few questions that were posed along the way, but perhaps there are others who wish to jump in with questions in the Q&A.
Great. Yeah, so the questions are open. So maybe Christian, maybe you could summarize some of the answers that we've already been talking to.
Right. So there were questions around. I don't see them open because here go the answers here. Right. So one was on the question of how can an innovation challenge as a program actually support the development of purpose and organization along the way for the contestants. And I think it's one of the particular traits of a challenge is that it allows you to mature and work with teams along the way as they go through the different gates of the challenge. So I think that's absolutely something that can be done and is is helpful. Another question was on how to involve more technical innovations in the teams in the challenge, in the case of the construction challenge we ran. And here I think this is a broad point around innovation through design, that the teams we worked with were very multidisciplinary, had engineers, business people, in some cases architects and designers, and that's, I think, a key trait. What we did there was those teams who did not have the sufficient skills or networks or partners to really support them in building new partnerships. So that's, again, I think there's quite a powerful capability growing mechanism built into innovation challenges that's helpful.
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple new ones. So Ono, Christian, I understand the partnerships in the challenge, and they see many partnerships in traditional contract forms and classic supplier relationships. What is needed on the collaboration side that is fundamentally different than in that traditional contracting type of relationship?
Right. So I think in the longer run, of course, contestants in a challenge like that would maybe form some more traditional partnerships. But what happens when you have the speed of an emerging challenge and you're not even sure that you win yet, is that you create more, I think, equal partnerships where you begin to explore what you can solve together, and maybe rather than just risk sharing. So in a way, along the way of an innovation challenge, it's more innovative partnerships. Now, how some of the teams did this legally, I was not that close to the process, just being part of the jury and having a team running it, but we can follow up on that one if you want to know more about what are maybe also some of the more traditional legal aspects of partnering along the way.
Yeah, I would also point on that front people to the Partnership Brokers Association as a community of practice around the work of partnering across multiple stakeholders, and with generally around impact. So they have a lot of great approaches for thinking about partnering, and obviously it's a complex process. And I think the interesting about a challenge is you get to structure a way for people to enter it in a way that's accessible, without having to have the heaviness of a lot of the legal agreements that a joint venture would need to be even to know whether they wanted to do something together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's see, Christine Martin, in a co-creation exercise using this tool, which kinds of stakeholders do you think would be important to include in the conversation? That's a great question, Christine. I don't really know. We were one of the things that we did when we were preparing for this workshop is we did a scan of what was available and discovered this tool. And so we've had some experience playing with it and working with different contexts. My sense now is that these kinds of the willingness to explore is built incrementally with different decision makers and different relationships over time. And I think that that's an important part of it. Once there is a willingness to get into co-creation, then I think that's where the exciting opportunities really lie. And so I think the idea of which kinds of stakeholders we'd want to include is obviously relevant to the kinds of goals we're pursuing. So again, I think the SDGs is a very good framework for thinking about which goals are we choosing to create impact on based on, and I think you can talk about how do you decide that. But within that, then I think that helps think about both the different partners that could be brought together and then the different stakeholders who have a stake in those kinds of impact goals. And because it is obviously difficult to manage to try to, engage everybody about everything. So I think there is a need to have some priorities, and I think selecting a few SDGs is a good way to start to get focus and engage the stakeholders relevant to that. Would be my question, my initial answer. Okay, and there's a couple more. I don't probably go. So let's just see how many more we can go for here. So we have Michael. And the last poll question, is a new way of business required for the future? Would be great, but do you think this is possible in the capital-driven market that we currently support and our neighbors to the south live by? So this is a Canadian. So I think we should talk about the capital markets for sure. Like where are we at with capital markets?
Well, I can maybe jump in on this one because I think something I also mentioned earlier today in a keynote I was giving in Netherlands was that I think we need to look at the ownership of corporates going forward. You also had the different types of models, legal models as well of corporates, and you mentioned B Corp earlier, Mark. And in Denmark we see two different models that are I think promising when it comes to more purpose-driven value creation and the role of corporates in society. One is the foundation-owned model, which is quite widespread in Denmark, where independent foundations that can take a longer-term view and that are sole owners of corporates are quite significant. Companies like the Lego company, like Grundfos that I mentioned, Danfoss, which is a leader also in thermostats and heating and cooling systems, and also in electric vehicles, is foundation owned. So I think that's one point. Another one is cooperatives, and then a cooperative movement that is I think being revitalized, and where we see some very significant and very innovative organizations in that space. So I think there's a question of the future of corporate ownership, and of course that doesn't address a lot of what's going on to the south of Canada. But I think that's worth considering when you look at the structure of the economy going forward.
Yeah, I've been paying a lot of attention to what's going on within institutional investors who have long time horizons. I'm thinking about pension funds in particular as an area where they're both very risk averse, but also need to be thinking about societal-based risks. They need to be thinking about climate risk in a very serious way. The time horizons that they need to invest and get returns on, they have to be thinking about climate risks, and they have to be thinking about climate opportunities. So I think that even in the traditional capital market space, there's a growing awareness of a need for change. It may not be as fast as some of us would like. And so I think that's the opportunity to look at these various kinds of ownership models and the different kinds of investors and different kinds of funding sources and different sources of capital, and how they might have different abilities to innovate faster. And I think that's where we're going to be wanting to monitor, is see where are these things actually able to take root and demonstrate the value. And some of those demonstrations of value, like some of the more conservative investors, will probably be waiting to see those demonstrations come to fruition before they make any big moves. But I think the signals are out there for people that participate in the capital markets, for sure. Yeah, so we're actually at the end of our time, I think.
I think we are.
Yeah, I think we could have gone on for much longer, obviously, but Christian from Copenhagen, it's now bedtime. So we really appreciate you making some time after a long day to join us on this webinar and allow us to get some information out to a lot more people that want to know about it.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks everyone for listening in, and I'll just say good night from Copenhagen.
Good night from Copenhagen, good night from Toronto, and we'll stay in touch, and we'll be sending out maybe an email to everybody afterwards to see how we can keep the conversation going. So we'll definitely be in touch, and so thank you everyone for attending.
Bye.
Bye.